Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the VSI webinar series. Today, we're going to be speaking to Dr. Ian Lawrence, author of, amongst others, Football Club Management. Today's session will be looking at toxic leadership with Ian's research into this area. As always, Tom Sears will be interviewing Ian, with Tim Coates managing the questions that will come in from the delegates. Before we kick off, I'm just going to mention a quote from Nelson Mandela, which I think is very apt in the times that we're living in at the moment. And it goes like this: sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. Sport can awaken hope where there was previously only despair. Sport speaks to people in a language they can understand. Tim, over to you.
Cheers, Tony. As always, guys, use the chat button at the bottom to type in your questions. We will ask them at the end. We'll pick the best 2 or 3. And without further ado, Tom, you're geared up for this, ready to go today. So over to you, my friend.
Thanks very much, Tim. And hi, Ian. Good to welcome you back after last week's chat. Last week, we focused on the positive aspects of leadership and how we develop those traits and what to look for. What do you mean exactly by toxic leadership? Give us a rundown on that.
Toxic leadership is very much, I think, a buzzword at the moment. I think we've seen some interesting examples from professional sport, and I think we've made our own interpretations of whether these people are acting in the best interests of the internal, the external stakeholders. Is it something which is very much driven by their own narcissism, their own needs? And I think the interesting thing is to consider where this kind of toxicity comes from, because these people are being elevated into really important positions. They're being appointed by people such as yourself who've been involved in that process. So how do we actually get these people into these positions of power? Can we recognize the antecedents? Can we recognize the characteristics, the kind of giveaway clues, which would be indicative of how this kind of toxic personality is going to reveal themselves? Because you don't appoint somebody on the back of an interview and a real due diligence research process and go, they're a toxic person, let's give them the CEO job or become the football manager. There's something I think that we can look to in terms of how they display themselves, their career, their characteristics. There's patterns that emerge that shouldn't surprise us when we do give them the label of toxicity.
And in terms of those processes, have you got any thoughts on how you could weed out those that display those characteristics and sort out those that will display the type of leadership that organisations need?
Well, you're probably better suited to answer that question than myself, but I'll give you my observations on it, and then maybe you can throw in the applied real world side of it. I think it's interesting from kind of an academic theoretical perspective, is to look at the romantic notions that we attach to leadership. You know, these are people who are these omniscient know-alls. We deify them. We get tattoos in some cases of these people on our backs and that. These are people who are held as being single-handedly responsible for success, which kind of does a disservice to the rest of the team that support them. These teams are very, very important. But I think we need to understand how we as selection panels, how we as individuals, how we're influenced by their behavior, by how these people very deliberately in some cases, how they think very, very carefully about what they say, what they don't say, because of the cues that it sends to us as the receivers of their message. And I think it's just a really, really interesting area of how they're able to attract us, how they're able to persuade us. And then if you think about a team of people or a group of people working in an office, how they're able to turn people from maybe being a little bit cynical, a bit cautious, skeptical of what this person's going to be like, and convert us into followers. It's just a really interesting process when you analyze what's said and what isn't said. It's something that maybe we could talk about a little bit more. But I'm interested from your perspective, Tom, in terms of the recruitment side of it. Is it something that you're aware of in the industry that people can charm a panel, can charm an interview selection committee?
Yeah, very much so. You see examples through whichever process you run of people that are a good fit for an organisation and have all the right qualities and can display those qualities. You also see people that can portray that they have those traits and those qualities, but maybe it's more superficial And that's the key to recruitment at a high level, be it a performance role, be it a senior executive role or a board role, is making sure that you run a robust process and you've got people involved with the experience, the expertise to understand how people portray themselves, understands the requirements of the role in real depth, and have that intrinsic knowledge of what the role requires, and really get to the nub of the people that are applying for that role. And that's a multifaceted process, as I said. And we run processes that probably are 5 or 6 stages of informal interviews, of informal discussions before you even get to a formal stage process. And I think making sure that you have the right people on the appointment panel is key as well, because in a lot of senior roles, you're perhaps relying on board members, non-exec directors that don't have that intrinsic experience, that first-hand experience. So you might need a bit of help there and a bit of additional resource, which is where organisations like Kinsey's Here's come in.
A lot of the stuff that I've come across and experience in preparation for the book that I'm writing is the status that people have usually acts as a really good kind of, it's an advantageous thing that they have in terms of establishing that level of trust and nurturing charisma within the people that they're speaking to, because it gives them this credibility. The thing that I'm interested in though as well is if you can park that to one side, and we know that candidates for these high profile jobs will all have similar educational backgrounds, they'll have similar qualifications, they're probably multilingual, they're probably very, very adept in a variety of different social situations. They've seen it, done it, got the t-shirt. Do you alert the people that you're working with in terms of the kind of cues, in terms of what they are saying, which if you're not careful of, you'll become manipulated by? Because that's something that I'm coming across in a lot of my research.
Yeah, we do analyse in depth post-interview, probably not pre-interview. We wouldn't brief people because we don't want to skew the process at all, or put our preconceptions onto anybody. So we let the process run, but then we analyse it, and we will strongly advise on where we think candidates have performed well and where they could add real benefits, but also areas to delve further throughout the process. And if you get to the final stage, you're probably only talking about 2 or 3 people that are under consideration. And you've really got to drill down and do your due diligence and make sure you understand that person, make sure that the achievements that they've articulated are their achievements, because many people will put something on their CV or talk about something in a process that are the result of a team effort as opposed to an individual effort. And that's where you've got to have that understanding and really drill down. And I'm interested in your thoughts on, you've worked in high performance sport, in football in particular. How many of the people that you come across or have analysed get to where they are on the back of other people's achievements and not displaying the leadership qualities and characteristics, as opposed to the genuine leaders?
I think it's interesting when you think about what leadership is and what are the component parts of leadership. There's a lot of research around at the moment which looks at transformational styles of leadership, ethical leadership, charismatic leadership, and the fundamental common denominator that old permutations and old discussions of leadership and current contemporary models have in common is that they need to form a relationship. And relationships are difficult to sustain. They're dynamic. They go up and down. They go up and down in our private life. They go up and down in our public life. So I think accepting that there's a dynamic nature to relationship, it's the people that we really revere and the people that who become icons in professional sport in particular are those people that have an X factor about them in terms of their leadership. As we just touched on, they've got similar qualifications, they've got similar backgrounds, they've all been through the same coaching qualifications. But the thing that separates them is this X factor. And I think for a lot of leaders, whether it be in business, whether it be in sport, or whether it be in our private life, it's almost an intangible aspect of how they communicate. And I say it's intangible, but I spent a bit of time looking at and analysing how a bunch of different leaders from within sport and outside sport in terms of how they organise, how they structure their communications. And there are certain common denominators that I've come across.
And just give us a bit more detail on that, Ian. What are those common denominators?
I don't know whether you've ever come across something called a stump speech, S-T-U-M-P. I hadn't until a while ago, but these are the people who preach on corners. These are the people who, the phrase comes from America, I think, originally. It's where somebody would stand on a chopped down tree stump so they could elevate themselves above the audience, and then they could preach to them. You see the same thing in London at Hyde Park Corner, where somebody will stand on a soapbox so they can elevate themselves and project their voice. And the structure and the vision that they articulate within their communications is very, very succinct. And you'll see a lot of similarities with what our Prime Minister is doing at the UK at the moment, and also particularly with President Trump. He follows a very, very prescribed, coherent, logical structure. And that's the first thing that he does. He repeats metaphors and stories. He opens up, if you're not new to the audience, you open up with your name. If you see these guys down at Hyde Park Corner, it's always quite entertaining when they're predicting the end of the world or whatever catastrophe is about to hit us next. I don't hear many of them talk about COVID-19, but you hear these guys eulogizing about what their mission is, what their passion is. And they start off with an introduction. Then they start talking about a solution that they have, how things can be different. Then they'll typically provide a call to action or what you can do to be helpful. This is what we're suggesting, which is innovative and creative and brand new, and it's different to everybody else that you've heard before. And then they'll have a conclusion which summarizes things, and with the call to action again repeated. So there's a certain formula that they go to in terms of the structure, which is simple, it's emotive, it's very simple in terms of its range and its vocabulary, but it's articulated with an enthusiasm and a passion. And I think a lot of leaders share that kind of stump speech structure, coherent structure to how they address people. And it's very, very difficult. It's very, very easy to analyze and talk about the constituent parts, but it's very difficult to sustain that level of passion, which I think is one of the things which ultimately leads to a sense of, well, I'm going to start doing it for myself now because I don't have the energy, I don't have the psychic energy, I don't have the emotional energy to sustain that level of passion. If you look at a lot of top coaches and CEOs, we use the term burnout. It's very difficult to sustain that level of intensity, that level of passion, that ability to take complex, abstract concepts and simplify them. But they tend to have a very coherent structure to how they engage with people.
And in terms of that burnout factor, I'm interested in that because is it a fact that the individual burns out themselves and they lose the passion for the role, or is it that they don't have the sustainability and the qualities to lead over a long period of time and people start to see through them? You see football managers, let's take Jose Mourinho, for example, and some of his tenures, he does a 2 or 3 year cycle, then moves on. What are your views on that sort of method of finding people moving on around role to role?
I don't think it's surprising. I don't think we should be surprised that football managers move on. I don't think we should be surprised that our CEOs move on. It's a very, very demanding, intensive, highly responsible. You get well remunerated for it. You get a lot of status. It's a very sexy position to have. But at the same time, it's an incredible load of pressure. And I think it's very difficult to speak on the outside and look at these people. You'd have to walk in their shoes to really appreciate the demands that they face. Whether it be Pep Guardiola taking a break from Bayern before he joined Man City, whether it's Jurgen Klopp talking about he's going to need a break at some stage. People do need a reset. And I think anecdotally, some of the stuff that, some leaders in other walks of business talk about is giving you this work-life balance. And I think, unfortunately, for, the high flyers in the world of professional sport's pretty much 24/7. It's 365 days a year. We're getting an enforced break at the moment, which I think is going to be great in terms of this psychological ability to recharge yourself and come back renewed. But the pressure that these people on, which you'll appreciate probably better than I do, having rubbed shoulders with a lot of the elite people within sports, and in terms of what makes them tick, is that it's kind of inevitable. So if we don't, if we're naive to that inevitability, well, then we're going to be surprised by it.
Obviously, we're doing these podcasts on behalf of VSI, and we're looking at developing future leaders, and there'll be people watching this that have got aspirations of holding these types of roles. For those people watching, how can they recognize the signs of burnout in themselves, and how can they address that?
I think last week we talked about, across a range of different subjects in terms of thinking about changing your perspective, is actually getting to know yourself, taking the opportunity to know what makes you tick, recognizing the warning signs, whether that's irritability, short-temperedness with your family and friends or colleagues at work, whether it be sleep disruption, whether it be dietary changes, whether it be a lack of enthusiasm for exercise, something which, and if you have those kind of honest, open conversations with friends and family and colleagues, these people will feel comfortable in saying to you, saying, there's something different. You know, ordinarily you wouldn't react in that way. Ordinarily you're doing this, this and that. You're usually a lot more patient in those circumstances. And if we can recognize those initial warning signs, we can do something about it. I think recognizing that we need to share the load with other people, that, you know, no man is an island, no woman is an island, that we operate in a complex network of relationships with people, and sharing that load and sharing that vulnerability is absolutely crucial. Some of the people that I've spoken to as part of the research for the CEO book that I'm writing revolves around the recognition, sometimes through having been through some difficult experiences, and in some cases near verge of breakdowns, is what have I learned from this? And I think this is an opportunity for all of us to go, what have we learned? Are we just going to go back to the status quo we did before and work like a dog and not exercise, not eat properly, not spend quality time with our family and friends? Are we going to pretend that we're these invincible characters at work and take on shed loads of responsibility? Or are we going to be a better facilitator? Are we going to be somebody who's a little bit more reflective upon how we engage with other people? And I'm hoping that for myself personally as well, that this is a period where we can reflect on it, we can come back and become something, an improved version of ourselves, where we can be a little bit more sensitive and empathetic towards both our own needs and also the people that we work with and love.
And from an organisation perspective, let's, for example, say you've got somebody in a high performance role or a CEO role, how does that organisation spot the danger signs that the leadership qualities aren't there, or things are going south and changes are needed?
Well, I think firstly, recognise what are you recruiting for in the first place. If you want somebody who has the charm, the charisma, the great interpersonal skills, that's warm, that projects warmth and empathy. At the same time, we want power, we want dominance, we want extroversion, we want people who have an energy which is going to carry people along, convert people from being cynics into followers. If we understand that that kind of passion, that level of intensity only burns so brightly for so long, that there's a natural light to it, well, then we can almost anticipate that within 2 to 3 years, and I think the average in the Premier League is probably hovering around 1 season at the moment for most Premiership managers, we need to have those contingency plans in place, those talent succession plans in place, to make sure that we have a pool of talents who can support these people, and also, worst case scenario, replace these people if it doesn't work out. So I think in terms of warning signs, I think we've got to be aware that, you know, it's interesting you mentioned before about the selection of how we appoint these people, that we need to try and park as best as possible our own sensitivities to being charmed by these people, because they are very, very adept at being charming. They're very, very charismatic. They're very, very good at persuasion, present very, very cogent, appealing arguments to why they should be appointed and why we should maybe turn a blind eye to patterns of behavior in the past. I think if we can park that in the initial stage, and if we can recognize what are the warning signs, which I'll come on to in a second, I think that makes us a little bit more alert to looking at these things. So if you look at Mourinho, for example, you know, he's somebody who, you know, let me just say as a caveat before I go on to possibly throw some mud in his direction, you know, this is a guy that I haven't met. This is purely ethnography. It's observation from a distance. It's having observed and paid attention to what he says in news conferences. It's anecdotal stuff, all this stuff poured together and research that underpins it. I think the warning signs were pretty much there from day one. If you are a Tottenham Hotspur fan or a Man United fan or any fan pretty much after his first appointment, which I think, you know, goes back to 2000 when he was first appointed at Benfica and he was there for a couple of months. Following that, what are the warning signs? Well, I think firstly, we need to consider the background. Is there a pattern? He's 57 years old or thereabouts. He's healthy. He's experienced. He's worked all over the world. Those are great. Those are great ticks in the plus column. Is he self-confident? Yes. Is he an extrovert? Yes. Do sometimes self-confident and extrovert people sometimes misjudge a situation, sometimes because of their confidence and their arrogance, sometimes use words which are misplaced, sometimes misgauge the situation because of their passion, their enthusiasm to be heard? Yes, they do. I mean, you go back to the classic thing of, I'm not one from the bottle, I'm the special one. A lot of people on the outside would perceive that as being ostensibly arrogant comment. But if you're in Mourinho's shoes or his supporters, you can say he's just highlighting the fact that he's extraordinarily qualified. He is different to people. And these extraordinary people do behave in maverick ways. So if we want somebody who's different, well, then we need to anticipate that at some stage their behavioral differences will lead to them taking risks. And that's one of the key things about these extraordinary people, is that they are inherently risk takers. They're entrepreneurs, as you call them in business. And they take risks because they're prepared to, especially in Mourinho's case right now, I think he's got so much success and the achievements, fantastic CV that he's got, that it's almost towards the latter part of his career, a devil may care approach. Financially stable, his records are not going to go away, but he still has this inherent intrinsic part of his personality, which is that he's a risk taker. Somebody who's prepared to be a maverick and unconventional shouldn't surprise us when he's observing and taking training in a London park during the COVID-19 shutdown, or when he is hiding in a kit box in order to get past being banned by UEFA for a Champions League game, or when he's running down the sideline and acting impetuously and sliding on his knees in front of the Stretford end, or whether he's shushing Liverpool supporters, or whether he's poking an eye in the face of the Barca assistant coach. If we want these extraordinary maverick people, occasionally, shock news, they will behave in extraordinarily bizarre, maverick, unconventional, unethical ways. Shouldn't surprise us. So you kind of get where
tolerate that? If they're getting results, should we tolerate that? And should we just say that's part and parcel of their makeup, but the pluses outweigh the negatives?
I think there's a responsibility on the behalf of the people who make the appointments to make sure that they recognize these early signs and they do something about it. And they become complicit in this kind of journey from somebody who's charismatic with great credentials and this fantastically charming, persuasive, attractive personality. At some stage, they'll have some early signs, some initial warnings that the hierarchy, that the owners, that the board can take note of. And if they choose to turn a blind eye to it because this guy's producing results, well, then they're complicit and they're involved in this downward spiral, because from everything I can see, if you look at any of the top level managers, at some stage, their performances, and the vast majority of managers are dismissed, they don't retire. The vast majority are dismissed because of poor performance, and however that's contrived. How do we recognize the stepping stones towards those failures in performance? They're quite easy to spot.
In my experience, from both working for sports organisations and also what we do now in terms of hiring senior leaders for sports organisations, I think one of the key signs for me is when relationships start to break up, or if that person can't form productive relationships at an early stage. How do you look at those sort of qualities and assess those qualities?
How do you assess what qualities, Tom?
The ability to form productive relationships and maintain those relationships.
Well, I think it goes down to what's said, again, what isn't said. It's kind of foundations of trust and charisma. We talked a minute ago about the stump speeches. These people communicate in a very coherent structure. They don't do things ad hoc necessarily. They'll walk in with a formula, with a very, very prescribed script that they know's worked before, in terms of, we talked about the opening that they make in terms of the conversation, the connection, they identify a shared problem, they provide some kind of unique charismatic solution to it, which provides their USP. They make They provide a call to action. This is how you can be involved in it. This is how we can share the journey. It's interesting that the number of times that managers talk about projects. You know, I think it was one of Jurgen Klopp's stock phrases, one of Pochettino's stock phrases. I'm interested by the project. You know, this is something that's got a start and finish to it. It's time sensitive. It's something where we can be creative, we're innovative. Owners recruit people on the back of, I think in a lot of cases for dismissals, that they want something different. They want somebody with a different approach. It's either going to be the sergeant major, or it's going to be somebody who's going to put their arm around the players. It's something different to what they've experienced before. This kind of creativity, this innovation is something which I think charismatic leaders are very, very good at providing. And they're very, very good. I don't really have noticed within their speeches and within their press conferences and stuff. They really, in some cases, I think overplay it from my position. But the use of personal pronouns, I, me, you, he, she, him, all these kind of things create a sense of intimacy with their audience. They make you feel as though we're not just talking in terms of abstract terms. I'm not on the outside looking in, but we're all in this together. This intimacy kind of leads to a relationship being, the initial stage of a relationship being formed. And you often hear, there was an interview a while ago with some of the people who work in the cafeteria at Liverpool, and they were asked to talk about the effect that Jurgen Klopp has. And he said he knows everybody's name, and he makes an effort to make sure that all new players and all new staff get to know the names as soon as possible. They try and learn the language, they try and learn English as soon as possible. And that kind of relationship is really, really important. You see it whether it be in professional sport or outside of professional sport. Leaders, really, really cool leaders that you want to feel associated with and work your hardest for, get to know your name. You develop this personal relationship. You want to go for a pint with them. They charm the audience, and it's one of the key things that builds trust is being vulnerable, getting to know these people. And you can do that through a couple of little tricks. And one of the classic one is the pronouns. I've noticed that a lot in terms of speeches that are made. We're in this together. It's not abstract. We're all part of the same team. It's a collective.
How often do you think organisations should review and maybe refresh their leadership teams?
Well, if you look at, just thinking about Mourinho from Benfica, he was there for a couple of months. Then he went to another team in Portugal. He was there for a couple of seasons. I think he averages, I think it's about 2 seasons per team before he moves on, before he's dismissed. I think if you recognise, and I think this is one of the skills that the longevity, particularly of managers such as Sir Alex Ferguson and Arsene Wenger, with their respective close to 20 years plus, is the need to recycle. If you're not going to change the leader, and there's an argument for changing the leader, you need to recycle your teams. You need to re-energize your teams. And it's a classic kind of cliche that managers get frustrated at the end of each season, particularly with their board, if their transfer budgets being cut and they can't replenish, they can't get new faces in. Because I think a lot of people at work, whether it be in sport or outside of work, you can become a little bit tired of the same messages, the same tricks being used, the same passion. Even if the leader stays the same, the audience become a little bit, it becomes a little bit more transparent. They become a little bit more cynical. They lose their own energy. So if you can recycle that team, I think that's really, really effective, or provide fresh blood into it. I think one of the things that Sir Alex did, to his greatest credit, was that he was very, very precise, I think, in recognizing the tipping point for a lot of the cultural architects within his organization, whether it be the head coach who needed to go, the guy who was delivering the training, whether it be the captain of the team, whether it be the best defender, whether it be anybody who's a cultural architect within the organization. As soon as you recognize the warning signs that they were no longer singing the party tune, that they were being disruptive, that they no longer shared the pride and the passion, the commitment, the energy. Didn't always get it right, obviously, because he's human, he makes mistakes. But he was all very, very ruthless in removing those people from his organization to make sure that his authority wasn't being undermined.
And do you think leaders get better over time and as they develop experience? And should they be supported more rather than change? We see a culture, particularly in football management, as you've said, but you look at other areas of sport. Let's take Australian rugby, both union and league, for example, where both CEOs have gone recently. Do you think there's an argument to say that they should have been supported more, given more time, more assistance to do the jobs properly? Because we seem to have a change culture within sport.
Yeah, I'd agree 100%. I think, number one, it goes back to maybe a phrase that you use within your business as well, recruitment with integrity, getting the right people involved. And that's getting the right ownership, the right board, the right structure behind you. If those people are tuned into appropriate vision, appropriate ambition, appropriate business plan, well, then they're going to appoint the appropriate people to those positions. If it's short-termism, you're going to want somebody who can provide a quick fix, and inevitably, I think 99 times out of 100, that's going to lead to disaster. So it starts from the top. It very much percolates from the people who are in charge of making those decisions, having a long-term, sustainable approach towards the business. And obviously, one of the things which is going to come out of COVID-19 is reflection upon those business models. Are they necessarily diversified enough? Are there income streams pretty much focused on broadcasting, or is it sufficiently diverse? Are we spreading the risk in order to make sure that we are sustainable? And obviously COVID-19 came out of nowhere, but a lot of people, without being Nostradamus, were predicting that was the golden egg in terms of what football survives upon. What was that bubble going to get burst anytime soon? Was there too much reliance upon broadcasting as a source of revenue? Were people gambling with the future of sport? And I think organizations that take a sustainable, long-term community relationship, focus upon longevity, are the ones that are going to survive it. But goes back to what I was saying before, without sounding like a scratch record, that if we recognize that the things which persuade us and charm us in terms of our appointments, if these people have what we could define as the X factor, there's a good chance that energy, that enthusiasm, that passion, that commitment is dynamic. It will lapse. It will go through a trough. That may be reflected by results on or off the field. We do need to support these people. If we recruit them for the right reasons, well, then we've got to be patient. And I think there's a lot of research out there suggesting that kind of patience pays dividends. And it's not just the LMA saying, because obviously they have the back of the professional managers, or the PFA supporting the players from that respect, is that kind of long-term commitment. We recognize it in our private lives. Why shouldn't it be the case in business, that there's going to be ups and downs, there's going to be peaks and troughs? And this is where I guess you guys become very, very important in terms of providing the right kind of candidates to the right organizations. There's got to be a cultural fit. If it's got to be a quick fix and we just want to stay above ground for the next 12 months, if we want to survive, we don't want to get relegated, well then, are you making the right decisions? Sometimes you've got to go one step backwards to go two steps forwards.
And if you're in a leadership position, or you're aspiring to a leadership position, and you find yourself displaying some of these traits of toxic leadership, things aren't going well, how do you take stock, press the reset button, and go again with perhaps a different approach?
I think it's very, very difficult once you start accelerating through this pattern of behaviors to sometimes take stock and realize it, because the reason, if we go back to, you can almost go through, I guess, maybe 4, 5, 6 different stages of an evolution or a pattern of how these behaviors emerge. And the very reason why these people are appointed is because they're persuasive, because they're emotional, because they're driven, because they're innovative, and because they're risk takers. And it's almost anachronistic that these people will have a huge circle of individuals who will have a confrontational conversation with them. Typically, these people have small teams. They have a team of confidants or lieutenants. And if you go back to any of the top manager, whether it be Jurgen Klopp and everybody getting worried about the departure of the brain, who was his assistant coach, well, what's turned out from that is that he's also got a very, very supportive team outside of these people who are, in theory, his lieutenants. Mourinho takes the same team pretty much with him everywhere he goes. That's changed at Tottenham, but before that, he took the same 4 or 5 squad of people around him. And unfortunately, when you surround yourself by Churchill nodding dogs and people who say, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, you don't get that criticality. You don't get that diversity of thought. And so there's almost a responsibility, I think, upon owners and boards to question, as much as we appreciate you need somebody who's got your back, why is it that only 4 or 5 people will be that supportive towards you? Can you create a culture? You know, Drucker said that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I'm a big fan of that. What is it about the new organization? Are you here just to be parachuted in? I'm here for 2 years, I'll spend a fortune and I'll leave. Am I going to do something, sow some seeds, lay the foundations for a project which will survive me, which will have longevity for people who will go on beyond me, because it's inevitable that you will be replaced at some stage. Performances will dictate that, or your health will dictate it. So I think there's a responsibility to make sure that you surround yourself with people who will challenge you, who will have difficult conversations, who will say, wind your neck in, that was inappropriate. You're proposing to stick yourself in a trunk of kit to smuggle yourself into a ground. It's unethical, it's bizarre, it's weird, it's morally suspect. It's going to drop us all in the proverbial. I don't think it's appropriate. And if you do that, well, then I think you've got a fighting chance. I think those people at that stage, if you have this brave, because, you know, there's a good chance that they may be getting the P45 if you have this kind of confrontational conversation. If you have these brave, courageous people who are prepared to draw you to account, I think it helps in terms of preventing a downward spiral. And if you look at Mourinho, for instance, you can almost see that he goes through this honeymoon period of, he gets identified by the board behind closed doors. You know, obviously when Pochettino's time was coming to an end, those conversations were going on at a boardroom level between Daniel Levy and the owner. And they were starting to scope out who the next person was going to be. They look for the kind of characteristics. They've got an idea of somebody who can affect a change pretty quickly. That probably narrows the field down to 2 or 3 people who are available. Mourinho's top of that list. Mourinho then goes through a honeymoon period on Sky Sports, and they start flirting with each other, and he starts talking about how great the squad is and stuff. He then gets appointed, and he gets appointed in this wave of enthusiasm and optimism and confidence and commitment, and we can drive this forward, and we've got a fantastic team. We don't need to dip into the pot. And that's all massively anticipated, all stuff that you don't need to have a crystal ball to see is on the horizon. But then there's usually a tipping point. And the tipping point, I think, is where these individuals become really crucial in terms of having honest conversations, whether it be the owner, whether it be the director of football, whether it be the chief exec, somebody in the C-suite, or whether it be somebody within your team of confidants, needs to start identifying what are the warning signs. And so, some of the warning signs are when people start, the behaviors often a very, very good indication of what's going on between the ears. You know, it's really interesting. You look at some of the research from Damien Hughes, and he talks about culture and behavior. And I really enjoy Damien's writing. And Damien talks about, if I'm paraphrasing him right, that a culture, in terms of an organization, are the behaviors that somebody displays when nobody's watching. The kind of covert behaviors, not the overt ones where you can be nice and smiling, enigmatic and crack jokes and serve people mince pies and give them a little glass of wine and stuff at Christmas to the press ensemble. It's the things that are shown behind closed doors, the things that are covert. And I'd be amazed if the assistant coach, the goalkeeping coach, the strength and conditioning coach, these people that work in day out with characters such as Mourinho, don't spot the indications of what are morally questionable, morally unethical behaviors, whether it be victimization of players, stroke bullying, whether it be disrespect, flagrant disrespect of opposition managers such as Arsene Wenger. I think he called him something like an expert in failure. You know, there's ways that people should conduct themselves, especially in public. And if he's prepared to make those kind of comments and those kind of behaviors in public for everybody to see, it's almost, he's reached the point of this disenchantment tipping point where he doesn't care anymore. And when you don't care anymore, you do things like poking people in the eyeball and disrespecting the opposition players and castigating players in public and in press conferences and belittling them. And it's almost inevitable then that the project's going to fail, because you've almost achieved the final stage, which is alienation. And this is where you take the final step, which is almost like deliberately trying to get yourself sacked, where you'll say in front of the world's press, well, my hands are tied at this stage. I've not been promised the transfer fund that I thought I was going to get. They visibly look sulky. They visibly look miserable. They visibly look as though they're in the process of breaking down. And it's almost as if that snowball develops momentum. And I think that there's a pattern of behaviors. The tragic thing for me is that these people that get appointed for all the right reasons, who are very persuasive, and over a short period of time, are very, very empowered and are very empowering for their team, it disintegrates because people are not prepared to have the conversation and saying, let's take this weekend off. I'll do this press conference. You've reacted to something on the sideline. It's interesting when you go through the rap sheet of somebody like Mourinho, the number of breaches or number of times that he's been charged for misconduct or breaches of, or questions the ethics or the morality or the inequity of decisions from referees is as long as your arm. It's a bit sad.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point you touched on there, Ian, that leadership is a collective responsibility and it shouldn't be down to one single person. And we had an interesting question that came in via Tony last week from a football club CEO who said that they were struggling to find ways through the current situation and they brought a consultant in to advise the board. Now, to me, that immediately would ring alarm bells that maybe that board hasn't got the diversity of thoughts, the collective wherewithal to look at things slightly differently, and perhaps the problems are more deep rooted and they should be looking internally rather than externally for that.
100%. I think it kind of doesn't surprise me, because one of the things that I've seen in my efforts in terms of working within professional football is that there's a lot of cynicism, there's a lot of caution towards working with external individuals, whether it be slightly changing in terms of sports psychology and the kind of emotional and wellness advices that are in and out of clubs. But traditionally, there has been very much an approach of, are we letting our secrets out? Is it a sign of weakness? Are we afraid that people are going to abuse this trust in terms of access to information? How is this information going to be used by our competitors? And it's very, very difficult, I think, for outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean people who aren't known to the organization. So it obviously helps if you're a former professional athlete and you rub shoulders with these people, because you've got the opportunity to build a relationship and establish trust with these people. I think for outside organizations, I think this is changing slowly, because I think a lot of good practice from the outside business world is now transferring over within professional sport, and different professional sports are more likely to adopt best practice from other organizations. Slowly but surely, I think there's a little bit more of an appetite. There's a little bit more of an open mind to analysis and investigation from this knowledge transfer from other organizations. But yeah, it is, going back to your original point, I think it is a bit of a reflection of poor communication, poor decision-making structures within an organization, when all the information's or all the decision is vested upon a small number of people. From my experience, having spent a bit of time with CEOs in preparation for the book, the really successful, the happy ones, the people who are at peace with themselves in terms of the decision making, the people who are the least stressed, are the individuals who have that diverse pool and are able to share those responsibilities and are able to take a little bit of a risk in some ways by giving somebody the responsibility to either succeed or fail in terms of that project, but give them a sense of accountability for it. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of organizations that are out there to help people who are prepared to come in as consultants. They're prepared to look at everything from leadership to strategy to commercial activities. But it starts off, I think, with very much having a leader or a CEO or an owner who says, I don't have the answers to everything. We need to share this responsibility. And that can be quite brave and intimidating for some businesses.
Ian, it's been fascinating talking to you over the last couple of weeks. Before I hand over to Tim for any questions that we received, I think just to capture your thoughts over the last two sessions, that leadership is all about resilience, bouncing forward, we talked about. It's about embracing diversity of thought. It's about being flexible, adaptable, and embracing the collective aspects of leadership. I think they're the key takeaways that I've got. And the other point is that you're probably no paid up member of the Jose Mourinho fan club.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be getting invited to the executive suite at Spurs anytime soon. But that's okay, I'm a Liverpool fan.
Excellent. Ian, thanks very much. Tim, over to you.
Cheers, Tom. Thank you very much. Ian, some great anecdotes there. Brilliant. I've got a question that's coming from Jack, actually, and I guess that we've covered it at a top level view. But the question is, at what point does an individual become a leader? And then, speaking of the X factor, are people characteristically leaders without being in a leadership position, or can leaders only be leaders once they've been put in that particular role? It's a bit of a precarious one, but I mean, the views on it would be it'd be interesting to catch yours, my friend.
It's like an interview question that for a job, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good one. I think leaders, in order to be a leader, you've got to have a follower, at least one. So leadership is all about relationships, and we're all leaders. You know, whether it be leading your son, your daughter, your best mate, your friend, people at work, helping somebody across the road. In order to be a leader, you've got to have at least one follower. And people only follow you if they, in the long term, they'll follow you initially. You could argue that's transactional, because they're getting something in return. But people will give of themselves and will commit and have energy and have confidence if you are consistent in terms of your behaviors. And I think that's one of the key things which I think surprises me a little bit about this managerial merry-go-round of the same characters being appointed for similar roles. As soon as a vacancy comes up, the same list of people throw their name in the ring. Is you want to see consistency of behavior. You want to see consistency of values. And if you have those values, and if you are consistent over a period of time, people gain confidence in you. And that confidence leads to people trusting you, even when things go up and down, because none of us are infallible. We'll all make mistakes. So when you do screw up, people will look at it in the big picture and they'll say, well, 99 days out of 10, they're a good person. Today, they had a little bit of an aberration. They're a bit stupid. They made a mistake, but we'll forgive them. They'll put it into context. And we see that within our own families. And I think a lot of organizations are very, very quick to punish people and kind of fail to accept that they're individuals, that they're human beings, they're going to make mistakes. But if over a period of time you are consistent, that engenders trust. So I think a lot of people who are on the journey to whatever their career is going to be and their ambitions, sometimes they become a little bit too eager, too impatient with what that journey is going to involve. I've seen it firsthand with the students that I work with and the colleagues that I work with. This kind of unbridled determination, egocentric drive to achieve their goals is going to leave a lot of victims on the sideline. You're going to have to step on a few toes in order to achieve that. If you act with integrity, if you act with the right vision, with the right ambitions for what you're involved in, over a long period of time, people respect that, and that becomes part of your idea. It becomes part of your personal branding. And I think the people that succeed are the people that, over a long period of time, demonstrate their trust, their vulnerability, their commitment, their honesty, their integrity.
Brilliant. Have you come across the Maxwell 5 levels?
I have, yeah, it's interesting.
So I was just thinking about what Jack was saying about the positions and the roles and how that gives you a permission well, not even a position, but people respect the first rung of the ladder. You get in positions like getting the keys to the car, isn't it? And then how you build on that. And then what you're talking about is like level 5 leadership, which I wholeheartedly agree with everything you've talked about. I think from I don't know what you call it, behavioral science, neuroscience, or psychology, or anything else you want to call it, all of those things kind of tick my boxes when it comes to being congruent and being integral. Your integrity and it's not what you do when people are around you, it's what you do when nobody's around you. It's those consistent habitual things that you put into process that you know you've done the right thing for the right reasons. And it's interesting how Mourinho comes with an ego. And I think for me, going back to what Tom was saying, is that bit of when we put into place, if we're doing things from an intentional point of view, so the intention to me is absolutely crucial of what we need to identify. And when we've looked at recruiting for big roles and stuff like that, the intention behind what they want to achieve. So if it's an ego intention, or it's led by ego, it generally comes from insecurities and various other things, and it's unstable, it's fallible. Whereas if the intentions come with the I'm talking about, think like Phil Jackson had an intention of building something that was bigger than he was, and the main outcome was the driver of what he was trying to build. So he was irrelevant almost, and built a culture on the side of it that far outweighed what he was trying to do. And like when we interviewed Sean Wayne the other week, he was talking about the same thing, the culture. When we look at the All Blacks, they talk about the same thing, the culture. We as leaders just become custodians of that culture and to lead it in a strategy of a direction. So it all comes down to one thing. The question would be, do you think we overcomplicate leadership, or do you think there's a natural leadership style that we kind of grow into?
I think that's probably where you differentiate between leadership and management. I think we all want to be I think it's going to sound like an enormous sweeping statement. I'm sure somebody will pick me up on it, but I think as leaders, we all respond to the same things. If we look at think about your favorite boss. Hopefully you've had one. I've had one or two in my 1,000 years, and these people share some similar characteristics, and they're not massively devoid, these characteristics, different to the characteristics that our family members share. These are people that have an ability to be, yes, they're determined, they're intelligent, they're self-confident, but they're also really, really caring. They project warmth, and it's a sincere thing, and it's something which you can quite easily contrive during an interview and be posed with a question by somebody on the other side of the table and say, demonstrate your empathy, and you could manufacture something because you're probably going to get a question along those lines. But it's that ability to sustain it over a period of time. And that level of self-sacrifice is really difficult for somebody to sustain, because at some stage we all become a little bit burnt by giving. We want it to be reciprocated. But the really, really powerful people that we have in our lives and from our memories and from our experiences are those people who do give more than they give back, than they ask for in return. They give. It's unconditional. And we grow to love these people, and so when they screw up, we forgive them, because inevitably somebody will make a mistake. So I'm interested in the leadership and where the experiences are, where we could look at somebody's CV, or we could do some kind of due diligence. If you're somebody from Tom's field, and you can look at where are the stories, where are the examples, is it consistent, or is it just done for effect? Is it something just done that's going to pop up on LinkedIn as an endorsement, which can be sometimes a little bit superficial because we want to try and ingratiate ourselves with the person that we're working with? Where is it in their DNA that they are self-sacrificing, that they really care, and that they really commit? And that requires a lot of due diligence, because there's not many of those people around.
No, you're right, 100%. Tony, I know we've got some questions that have come in that Tony's going to talk from. I think they're coming from not only South America when it's passed in. So without further ado, Tony, you got some questions for us, bud?
Ian, we're going to go on a short trip around the world. So we've got a question. The first question is from a football coach in the UK. Doesn't give his name. Quite interesting question or statement he's making here. He says, I have narcissistic behaviors. I like some of them. Others I know are counterproductive. What would be your advice?
Well, Yeah, I think it's necessary to understand what narcissism is and what it isn't. It's on a spectrum. So, there's broad criteria for being narcissistic. I think from a self-preservation, from an instinctual, from a ego self-esteem perspective, that there is a level of narcissism which is absolutely healthy, absolutely appropriate. So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. And there's a lot of charismatic people who are inherently narcissistic. It kind of goes with the DNA of being charismatic, and it goes back to what I was saying to Tom before that. If we want somebody who's going to persuade, attract, convert us into followers by their charisma, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a big chunk of narcissism in there somewhere waiting to come out. The problem is I think in terms of narcissism, there's nothing wrong with having that strong self-esteem, high self-esteem. It's when that it becomes a preoccupation with yourselves. It's where it inevitably kind of interferes with your organization or your ethical goals. In other words, it interferes with clear decision making. And it makes you think that I'm now working for myself. It's a siege mentality. I'm going to park the bus. It's me against the rest of the world. The rest of the people in the office and the organization can F off. It's all about me. And it's recognizing the stepping stones to where that appears. And again, reiterating what we spoke about with Tom a second ago, it's having people who will poke you in the ribs, take you for a drink, take you for a coffee, take 5 minutes, get some fresh air, and let's have a quick think about what's just been said and reflect on it. So the fact that the person posing the question says that they recognize some of those elements is a good thing. It's just a question of keeping a handle on it and having conversations with sufficient number of people whose opinions that you respect and value, where they can just say, it's just starting to slide beyond self-esteem now, and it's starting to become something where it's interfering with what the project's about, what the organization's about. I think typically, without going overboard, because I think you've got some other questions. One of the signs, I think, of narcissism is when people aggressively react to criticism. They have this high sense of psychological entitlement, and their behavior is just looking sincere. And if you don't recognize it, other people around you recognize it. When you just become a little bit too grandiose, you become a little bit too much of an exploitative, seeking prestige, power, glory type behaviors. All those things are behaviors which, whether it be covert, behind closed doors, overt in the general public, are things which people can observe. But necessarily, narcissism isn't a bad thing. It isn't something necessarily to be worried about. It's when it starts to undermine your own personal and professional goals and ambitions that it becomes counterproductive.
Okay, we're going to jump on a short flight. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? We're going to go over to Spain. We've had a question from, all it says is a female in sport in a C-suite position. The question is, I'm a female. Are females less impacted by toxic behaviors?
It'd be great if that was the case. I think there's... I think it'd be great if you could make the sweeping statement that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I think that there's a lot of criticism of those kind of broad generalizations. I think a good point, though, is in terms of culturally how we treat people. I think that there are some stereotypes of the environments in which we bring people up. I think it's interesting in terms of the individuals that I've worked with for the C-suite book that I'm writing, is that I try to get a balance of experiences and a balance of people with various different backgrounds to try and find out if there's some kind of set of common denominators, some kind of generic background of experiences or traits or behaviors which are indicative of C-suite people. And there are a few things that come out of it. But one of the things, regardless of whether you're male or female, is this ability to A, not take yourself too seriously, B, not think that you've got the answer to every single question on the earth, and C, share responsibility. And this kind of diffusion of power and diffusion of responsibility, this not needing to be in the limelight, is indicative of elite performers, certainly within the boardroom. So I don't think necessarily it's a feminine trait. Individuals may see that more often, where that's down to some kind of cognitive bias that they have, where they ignore it appearing in men and they look for it to appear in women. I haven't seen it in terms of my research, certainly.
Okay. And then finally, we're ending up in Brazil. We've got a question from Eduardo. And it's a statement with a question. His statement is: weak men create hard times. Strong men create good times. How do you interpret this, Ian? He's put in his email here is that he is in a leadership position in sport. It doesn't say which sport.
I think if you look at if you do a little bit of analysis of history, you'll see people who are a good fit for certain contexts, for certain environments, whose messages, whose vision has appeal for a certain context. And I think it's necessary to understand the dynamics of the context in order to really appropriately analyze what is a good person. You know, it's got to be a square peg for a square hole. So if you look at, Winston Churchill, say in the UK, this is a guy that was this charismatic, enigmatic, risk-taking, maverick individual that was perfect for wartime Britain in terms of the results and producing a coherent, focused effort during the Second World War. Tried for re-election. At the end of the Second World War, was voted out. Ended up pretty much in obscurity by the end of his political career. So there are individuals who are the right people for the right organizations, for the right organizational context. I'm not sure that makes them necessarily good or strong. It just makes them appropriate. And going back to what Tom said before, I think there's a need for organizations, especially in the light of, how things are how the dust is going to settle on the back of the commercial and the business implications, the health implications, how we treat each other on the back of COVID-19. There is an opportunity to reflect on what we want from our leaders. And I think if we don't need to look too far away from our families in terms of who those good people are. And if you're fortunate enough to be around those positive role models, those positive, influential, charismatic characters, you'll have them in your family. And these are people that will do anything for.
Ian, that's great. Really appreciate your time. Fantastic, detailed information. We've been on an hour now, and that's flown by. So as always, really appreciate your time. Everyone who's listening from all over the world, as you can see with the questions that we've asked, I hope you've enjoyed this afternoon's webinar with Ian. Tom, as always, thanks for asking the questions, and we'll see you all next week with the next webinar session. Thanks, guys.